Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey everybody, it's Jessa. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. Before we start, I don't want to forget to invite you to the free training that I have put together and figured out a way to host so that people can get to it at any time. It's called How to Make Sex Easy Without It Feeling Like an Obligation. It is for basically otherwise happy couples who are struggling with sex, where this has become the thing that's stressful, anxiety-provoking, loaded, fraught, risky, however you're experiencing that burden. This webinar is really geared toward helping you, first of all, understand what you're probably doing that is actually making it worse, because there are some really common mistakes. And then what it really takes to make sex easy, to become easily intimate instead of burdened like this. So if you want to visit that training, now that I've got it up and running, you can go to intimacywithease.com/training and you can access it right now, right? Immediate access. So let me know what you think. I'd love to have you drop by and share that. And we're going to talk today about a topic I covered way in the beginning of my podcast. So it's been more than 2 years since we've just talked about sex therapy. Like, what is it? How does that work? What can people expect? What is this like to get help with sex, individually or as a couple? How does this work? Who do you look for? How do you know who's qualified? That kind of stuff. So my guest today, Paula Leech, is a sex therapist around Boston, actually. And while she doesn't see clients right now, she's got kind of a new baby, she is still a sex therapy supervisor, and she does teaching of sex therapists. So this is a passion of hers, is getting people into this field and working effectively with people towards their sexual goals. So she's going to join me to talk about sex therapy, what it is, how it works, how she does it, what she thinks is important, what you guys could look for, all that kind of thing. I hope you find it helpful. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. Thank you so much for being on the show with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I this is sort of a back to basics episode. Sort of like what even is sex therapy and what does this look like for people? Because I feel like I do these topics every week, and some of them are really in depth and intense, and then it's like, let's just take a balcony view to what this is all about.
It's very easy to get really intense with this area of work. Right. The subject in general, it's really easy to go into down a wormhole. People think that sex therapy is just like this separate little training. Like maybe you go and you do a couple weeks of training and then you've got it. And no, it's like you could study this for your entire life and not understand.
Right.
So I understand.
So for people listening, like how do you define what sex therapy is? Like you must get that question, right, from potential clients or something like that. Like what is it?
So, interestingly enough, there are a lot of similarities with traditional kinds of psychotherapy. So people are always kind of surprised when they come to visit me and I'm talking about their family of origin, or I'm talking about their attachments, or I'm talking about past relationships and self-esteem and self-worth and these things and anxiety. You traditionally think about these things in like more of an individual therapy context or psychotherapy context. All of that is there. The thing that is added to it is a behavioral component for me, and that is oftentimes with sensate focus, which is a series of touch exercises that you implement that people take home and do. Mm-hmm. So it's mind body. So for me, it is tapping into the wisdom of the mind and the heart, but then also looking to the body to give us wisdom around sort of what lives there, what barriers to intimacy exist there, but then also how can we cultivate a different relationship to our body and to our senses and our sensory experience to get us more in touch with our instincts, with our sensory experience, with pleasure, and with ourselves. So it's really mind body.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think there are aspects of that probably apply in regular, air quotes here, regular therapy too. But right. Like, well, I mean, one of the things I want people to understand when they come to sex therapy is we are going to be talking explicitly about sex, which doesn't necessarily happen in other forms of therapy, right?
That is true too. Right. I train a lot of therapists. I'm a supervisor of sex therapists. And so part of it is get really comfortable talking explicitly about sexuality.
Right.
This has been a big topic with regards to children, teach children proper body parts, not just the jokey ones. We can have the jokey, silly ones, but let's also teach them the proper names for our body parts and for our genitalia and our private parts. But as sex therapists, it becomes so important that we're not only able to talk very openly and explicitly about sexuality in our bodies, but that we're comfortable with it. So a lot of the training is about sort of growing that comfort.
Right. And then I always like to just mention this because I think there's still misunderstandings about this, but for anybody listening, sex therapy is still just talk therapy, right? The body part of this happens at home. There is no touch, there is no sex, there is no, like live coaching. This is regular therapy just specifically about sex.
100%. It's really funny because when we opened a business that had the name Sexual, South Shore Sexual Health Center was a business that I worked for. It's still up and running. It's fantastic. But we were getting the signage in the directory of the building. And they were like, we can't have that word in there. We can't have that word. It's too offensive. And, people might have a difficult reaction to it. And they're like, by the way, what are you doing up there anyway?
Yeah, right.
What are you doing? I'm like, we're not doing anything other than talking about this. So absolutely, there's no taking off of clothing. The body part is 100% at home. And that's like you were saying, a lot of the more sort of traditional models of therapy do incorporate mind-body stuff, 100%. For me, a big part of, again, sex therapy comparatively is that I'm almost instantly prescribing take-home exercises.
Yeah.
And that touch component almost instantaneously is part of the process, unless there are big things to tackle first, big relational issues, big trauma stuff that we need to look at,
right.
That sort of thing.
Right.
But it's taken home, and then you come back and report back around how the experience was in great detail. We zoom way in.
Right. I mean, I say to clients, I'm sure you say this, I say to clients all the time, we are not going to fix these things sitting here talking about it or thinking about it, right? It doesn't happen on my couch. It is so dependent on you guys going home, having experiences and learning from those, right? And making that progress experientially.
100%. And, oftentimes, for me at least, the vast majority of the sexual struggles that I work with are anxiety-based. Anxiety is a major culprit behind a lot of the difficulties that we bump into. And as a result, we've had experiences around our sexuality that are challenging, and they get reinforced over and over again, right? That anxiety, that maybe that fear or that insecurity gets reinforced over and over again. And so part of what sex therapy is that we're trying to unravel that, untangle those associations and create new ones. Not even in the beginning, it's not even necessarily about pleasurable ones, but it's about moving that anxiety out of the room.
Yeah.
Bringing in something different.
So in my practice, I work only with couples at this point. I'm just curious for you, like, where do you see the balance of working with individuals in this, and where should it be couples work? You know, what are your thoughts about doing this with a partner, if you have one or not? Or
So I got my master's in marriage and family therapy. So I'm a systemic thinker,
yeah,
always thinking relationally, but I also just happen to believe that a lot of I really can't think of any exceptions. Our wounding, so to speak, happens in relationship, right? And so I believe that healing happens in relation too. And that obviously doesn't always need to happen. We also look at our relationship to ourselves, right?
Right.
And we look at our relationship to different parts of ourselves. The child part of ourselves or the adolescent part of ourselves. But if you are in a relationship or relationships, if you're polyamorous, I find that therapy tends to move a bit quicker, tends to be a bit more impactful if the partner or partners join.
Yeah.
So I almost always recommend that. And again, the dynamic that exists in the couple plays a huge role. And so when I see, say a male identified individual for erectile dysfunction, oftentimes we can trace back the history of this particular challenge, and we can find some exceptions to its existence, right? And so we want to look really close at the relationship and the dynamic that exists there. How is the other partner reacting when the male loses his erection? What's the exchange that happens between the two of them when that goes on? What's the pressure then feel like in the room? And with these struggles, we feel oftentimes a great deal of sort of shame. With erectile dysfunction, it can feel very emasculating. So again, we want as much as we can to move that partner to a supportive position. If they're all in, get them on board. Let's be purposeful about how we react moving forward, so that the relationship itself isn't a big source of pressure and stress.
Right. Because when you're talking about, a lot of these challenges are anxiety related, right? What you're talking about here is how a couple can co-create that anxiety, how this gets handled, how it gets reinforced. I mean, so often I have people reach out to me who individually think they are the problem. It's my penis that's not working, or it's my vagina that's not working. And so I'm the one that, has a problem. I should come in and fix this. And my message is always, no. This stuff is always co-created. Sexual issues have an impact on the relationship. The relationship has an impact on the sexual problems. Like, this is so vital, right, to the treatment.
100%. It is always the tip of the iceberg, just the tip of the iceberg,
right.
The actual symptom. And it's interesting because, as I'm sure you've experienced, all the time I'll have a couple come in. My partner's the issue. I'm here to support my partner, but this isn't really about me. And we get going, and it's like, all this stuff emerges. And sometimes folks don't like that very much. You know?
Right. I can imagine it's easier to think, it's just my partner that has the problem, right? I don't have anything to look at. Yeah.
But it's complicated,
Yeah.
It's complicated stuff.
Yeah. So what do you think, or what do you say about people that maybe are single and having some of these sexual challenges? Like, how much work can get done in sex therapy? I'd be curious to hear, because I have my own ways of thinking about that, I guess, but
sure.
We're all different. So
absolutely. Well, I try to encourage folks I still think, irregardless of what your relationship status is, this is incredibly beneficial work. I don't think that any of us make it to adulthood unscathed around our sexuality, personally. And I think that all of us are struggling to a certain extent with a sense of disembodiment. That's just sort of the culture that we live in. So I think that sex therapy, just like any kind of therapy, is just good maintenance and good stuff to be doing, a good part of our healing. But so since I use the example of erectile dysfunction, so if I have a single cis male identified person, that penis owner that wants to work on erectile dysfunction, we take a look at, because erectile dysfunction isn't actually the loss of your erection, but it's your reaction to it, right? So we kind of trace back again this difficulty, and we build skills as far as I mentioned before, moving into the body, getting to know your body in a greater way, gaining a greater sense of control over what's happening in the body and in the pelvic floor, because often with men with erectile dysfunction. They tense that pelvic floor when they're losing or when they think they're losing. And it gives them this sort of like instantaneous sort of, I feel like I'm helping myself because it pushes blood flow to the shaft of the penis. But then ultimately it cuts it off and then they've sabotaged themselves. So there are these things that we do as people that are kind of funky, that feel intuitive, but are actually making matters worse.
Right.
So we build a new set of tools, a different way of coping when anxiety enters in the picture. Again, a greater sense of like mastery over what's happening in my body, a greater sense of control, a deeper understanding even of just what's going on. Because for most of us, half the time we don't even know what the anxiety feels like in our body. We don't know that we're clenching or tensing or, we don't know that. And so I like to work with my clients to make sure that they are supremely aware of what their body's doing, how it's reacting, so that they can make choices that move them in a different direction and in a direction that potentially sets them up for a more pleasurable or relaxing or whatever it may be experience that they're looking for sexually.
Yeah. In my mind, though, there's still going to be I don't know if I want to call it a leap, a step to then partnered sexual activity after that, right? Like the anxiety is going to be a different kind of thing. And so you can do all this work and all this practice and all this setup, and you're still going to have a bit of a step to manage that with a partner. Absolutely. And, we have to talk about that. Right.
We have to manage those expectations. And I'm very, very clear about that. Like, this is the path. This is how I conceptualize the work. Are you on board? Does this sound good? And just so you know, because there is a relational component to this, often really big relational component to this, when we step back into a relational sort of system, then some of this stuff is going to show back up. Or not.
Right.
Or not. Who knows? But at least if it does, you'll have a sense of where to go and how to navigate it differently. Right.
Yeah.
So that's always my hope. I've definitely worked with quite a few individuals around different sexual struggles, and oftentimes sexual struggles that have led to endings of relationships. And so, of course, that's incredibly anxiety provoking moving forward. Right. Oh my gosh, what if this follows me? What if this happens again? And so what I love about therapy in general, but sex therapy and sensate focus in particular, there's a lot of mindfulness. We're doing a ton of mindfulness as part of this work. So that's part of working on that anxiety in an ongoing way as well.
Yeah. So what does the process look like if, again, listeners have not done sex therapy before, what, and I know that we're all different. We probably have different ways of working or something, but what can people expect with you? Like what's sort of a basic way the arc of the work goes?
So what typically happens is I treat the first session with anyone as kind of a consultation. And I like to, this is an infamously challenging topic, right? And it's so emotionally loaded. And we all have our own stuff around it. So I really like to make sure that in the beginning of our first session and towards the end, that you're seeing some of who I am. I'm not the expert behind a pad of paper, sort of us and stuff, right? Like I am a human being. I'm in this journey called life with you with all of my imperfections and flaws. And so I try to be deliberate about making, especially the beginning and the end, light, icebreaker stuff. I like to talk a little bit about you're sitting across from this weird person. Let me tell you about how I work. Please don't, please let me know if you get offended or if I push too hard. I like to give people a sense for what they can expect from me. And I like to make sure people know that I really value the relationship, and it is a relationship. It's an important, intimate relationship. And so I like to give them a sense for how I work around that, which is to constantly check in and use the relationship. Things that happen in therapy often happen in the world. So I want to talk about that. But I like to give people a sense for what to expect. And then I like to just get to know folks a little bit. Have you lived here? What's your job like? How long? Just basic stuff. And then we delve into whatever has brought them into therapy. Yeah. Because again, I feel like that beginning part is so important. It's really takes a whole heck of a lot of vulnerability to be in therapy, to go to therapy, to sit across from someone and talk about this stuff. So I really like to spend a good amount of time just having a comfortable back and forth before delving into the difficulty. And then what typically happens is if you're with a partner or partners, I hear everyone's version of the presenting problem or the concern, get to know everybody. And then at the end, I give my sort of conceptualization at that moment in time of what the work is, right? Because it's always evolving and we're constantly sort of assessing, reassessing that, that whole process. So I like to give my ideas about how we would move forward, given the information that I'd received in just that short amount of time.
Right.
And then I like to ask people to go and sit and think about it, because since this is such an important relationship and such an intimate relationship, it needs to feel like a good fit. And so I answer questions, and then we end again. I like to end really light. I like to also show people that we can have challenging, kind of uncomfortable conversations, and then we can be okay. We can come through those feelings and be okay. And so that's typically what it looks like. And as far as the overall arc of therapy, it really depends on what we're working with. So some things, obviously, like I work a lot with sexual trauma, and that is kind of, that's longer term work most of the time for me, versus something like I typically have, for me, vaginismus tends to be shorter therapy, briefer therapy. I collaborate with a lot of pelvic floor folks around that who are amazing. And so tends to be, but of course there are always exceptions. There are always exceptions, but that's, I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm hearing in your description, I mean, I don't have all this formulated in my head, but I'm hearing you set some things up in the first session that people could expect, which is you're going to be a person in that room, that's mindful of the relationship between you and your clients, that you're welcoming feedback too. If anybody gets offended or has, raise your hand if you've got a concern kind of thing.
Yep.
And that you're going to share what you're thinking.
Yes.
Right. Your conceptualization, what you're seeing, what you're believing about this.
Yes. I'm going to be honest. Going to be honest. And, as a lot of us do, we emerge from our master's level training.
Right.
I have to be neutral, and there's no forming any alliances, and there's no such thing as blame. And then, I was exposed to a couple amazing therapists. I don't know if you've heard of Terry Real, but he's in the Boston area too.
Oh, okay.
And I'm a big fan of his work because he showed me that you can go directly at the hard truths. You can be really honest and transparent with people, and that actually, most of the time, they really appreciate that, rather than trying to go indirectly at something or around, or, trying to be a blank slate or any of that. That's, it's impossible anyway. So I really, the relationship that I have with my clients, I'm trying to model aspects of relationships, right? Anyways, I don't want people to think that I expect them to be vulnerable, and I myself am not going to challenge myself to do the same. And so I just really believe that really effective therapy is like when you're sort of the most intimate, vulnerable parts of the therapist meet the most intimate, vulnerable parts of the client. Yeah. So for me, it's exhausting. It's really hard work, because I take it really seriously, and it just it's just, for me, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's psychological, it's, it's everything.
It's interesting that you say that it's exhausting, because I know what you mean, but to me, it's also way less exhausting than if I had to present something like a blank slate or not be authentic. Or, I mean, in some ways, it is so much less work to just show up and be real and be honest. I mean, I have to be on, but it also, you know what I mean? There's a certain amount of energy we don't have to expend in kind of putting on some sort of front or something.
100%. And, that's been an interesting part of the conversations around what it's like to do therapy during COVID. Mm-hmm. When we're all going through this together, and we, as therapists, we don't have any outside perspective. We don't have any outside expertise, any of that. So, and we are all struggling with our own sort of fears and anxieties and grief and stuff around this. And so, there's been a lot of conversation around trying to pretend like that's not real for you, trying to pretend like I don't have my own sexual struggles, my own history around this. Not only is it, yes, way more work as a therapist, but also I feel like that is felt in the room. I feel like that is something that people tap into pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. You know, it's for me, therapy is exhausting in the best way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe that.
I find it fascinating. You know, I find relationships and people to be fascinating. So part of what makes it so exhausting for me is because this job, we don't get a blueprint or a formula for how to do this. And so every session, I know I'm going to be walking into a universe that I am challenged to sort of get to know and to try and understand and make sense of with my clients. And because that is such a heart, spirit, mind, venture, I'm like, I can't see like 8 clients a day, you know? Like,
yeah.
I used to be able to do that. I don't know what happened to me, but yeah.
You got better, I guess, right?
I hope. I don't know.
It's Jessa here, just taking a quick break. Thanks for listening. Are you interested in being a guest on the show? I'm always looking for people with expertise to share that could enrich other people's sex lives. And I'm also interested in hearing from people who have transformed their own intimate relationship and would want to share their story with my listeners. So if you've got something to contribute to the discussion and want to see about being featured on an upcoming episode, please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, and check out the Be a Guest details. You'll find everything you need there.
What do you think people's biggest fears are coming into sex therapy, and how would you answer those? Like, I don't know how many to ask you to give me, but
yep.
top few maybe fears or misconceptions or something that people might bring in that you would want to address.
Sure. I think what comes to my head right off the bat is judgment. It's simply judgment and shame, further judgment.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of clients that it definitely is a process getting to the point where they're telling me the real reason why they're there. And then they're kind of bracing. And again, this is where it's so important to be honest and authentic with our reactions, because there have been things that have surprised me, but most of the time I feel like what is normative in terms of sexual behavior is vast and expansive, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's such an awesome moment for me when I get to be like, oh, okay, let's talk about that. And they look at me like, but you're not horrified? No, of course I'm not horrified. This is okay. Let's talk about why you have come to the conclusion that it isn't. Or let's talk about how this has been adapted for you. Or let's talk about some of the origins of this and how you're trying to maybe get this thing under control, or explain this to your partner, or bring this into your relationship. But I think, again, because we're not given any kind of a decent sex education, people come in with things. And even though most of us have been on Google and we're researching things, and there's communities out there, and there's a lot of ways that you can, find networks of people that have similar interests or similar struggles, there's still that 12-year-old or 10-year-old or 15-year-old in you that goes, this is not okay. Is this okay? Is this all right? Like, this isn't what I was told was okay, or this isn't what I learned. Right. So I think that fear of judgment and further shame or isolation is the big one. Yeah. And then another one is, another big one is it's still fear of loss of relationships because of the sexual struggles that they may be experiencing.
Yeah.
Fear of never getting past to the problem.
Yeah. I think the way I put that, the thing I hear a lot specifically stated is fear of being broken, right? Like, either I am broken, I've come into this believing something's really, really wrong with me, or our relationship is broken and doomed, Yes. And that how many couples have had, even in the first session, so are we normal? Is there hope? I mean, is this, are we going to be okay? Can we do this? Right? It's so pervasive. And I wonder how much that stops people from coming to therapy, because they're really afraid what we're going to say is, oh yeah, you're dead, you're doomed. No hope here, as opposed to the relief of realizing, that you can work through these struggles.
Absolutely. I mean, I think people that come into therapy are the bravest people that I have the honor of meeting, because absolutely it often takes a lot for us to get to the point where not only am I willing to make myself vulnerable, but I'm willing to make myself vulnerable and expose some of my biggest secrets, or I talk about things that I have received immense amount of judgment around in the past, or immense amounts of shame around in the past, where I've lost a great deal because of these things in the past. It just takes a ton. Yeah. So absolutely.
Yeah. The other fear that comes to mind for me, again, because I work with couples only, I'm always seeing desire discrepancy. Somebody always wants more sex than the other person, right? And I believe that the lower desire person often comes in with a fear. Well, first of all, a fear that maybe they're broken. What's wrong that I don't have as much desire? But also, I wonder how many of them fear, I'm just going to tell them to have sex. Or like the whole point of this is to get them to have sex that they are not enthusiastic about, as opposed to, I try to reassure people, my job is to help you want as much sex as you can want, not to just have sex. So
yes, and it's surprising to me how often there's conversations around kind of this permission giving to not have sex.
Yeah.
I've seen quite a few couples who are like, we are fantastic, but we feel like we should be. Is there something wrong with us because we aren't having sex 5 times a week or 3 times a week or whatever?
Right.
And because that's such a big thing. I mean, at least for me, that was part of my script growing up, is like, if you're not having sex, then your relationship is broken and you're in a sexless marriage and this is terrible. And this is when it's one way of cultivating intimacy in a relationship. It's one way of cultivating closeness. It's one way of expressing your feelings, around to your partner, with yourself, experiencing pleasure. It's one way. So oftentimes I see couples who feel very, very close in these other ways. And so they don't need it as much. And that's okay.
It's interesting. I've contributed lately to a couple articles for Mind, Body, Green. The editor seeks me out for this, and she's really wanted to talk about sexless marriage or sexless relationships. And my first response is always, hey, if 2 people are not having sex and are happy with it, there is no problem. That's not what we're talking about. We're only talking about people that have distress over this because of their own desires, not, from some idea of what the culture teaches us should be happening. So.
And, I think it's important for people to expect that there's going to be desire discrepancy if you're in any kind of long-term.
Oh, yeah. It's, that's the first thing I say is universal, because why would any 2 people want the same amount of sex? I mean, of course there's a discrepancy. So
there's going to be. And so it's again, it's super important for people to understand that is totally a normative part of being in a relationship. It ebbs and flows. It can be really temperamental, and people are really shocked to learn, going back again to erectile dysfunction. I see a lot of erectile dysfunction.
I guess so. Right?
I see a lot of erectile dysfunction, but a lot of the male-identified folks I work with erectile dysfunction don't have a whole lot of desire. And if something isn't associated with fun, pleasurable feelings, we're not going to crave it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, you have these experiences where maybe some stress gets introduced, or you've had a bad day and now it was kind of fumbly and awkward, and then your partner got in a fight, and that stuff doesn't just necessarily vanish. Sometimes it helps you,
Yeah. Well, and that just makes me, it's sort of another tangent, but it makes me think of the myths and the expectations that so many people have. Like, these penis owners should all be like ready to go, always want sex, don't need any stimulation. Just the thought should be enough. And like, sometimes people struggling with erectile dysfunction, they're not getting the stimulation they need. They're not getting the warm up they need. They're not switching gears. It's not.
So much myth busting.
Yes,
and I love doing it. It's one of my favorite parts of the job is myth busting. Like, let's get these things out of here. They're trash.
Yeah.
One of the big ones, and sometimes this is real, obviously, sometimes this exists, but a lot of the times attraction isn't necessarily the problem at all.
Yeah. Right.
Oftentimes it's the opposite. I care too much. I'm too focused on what you might think. I'm too invested in what your experience is like that I'm not in mine. I'm not mine. I'm thinking about this too much.
Yeah.
Obviously, very dependent on the couple that you're working with, but vast majority of the time I get to bust that myth too.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is about, suddenly my partners just must be, not attracted to me, or they must be, wanting to cheat on me, or they must be watching porn too much, or, any of those funky things that shows up.
Yeah. So as someone who is also, I mean, you're a supervisor, you've done teaching and training in sex therapy. Would you just speak to how important that is for like listeners, if they want to go get sex therapy, how they end up working with somebody who's qualified to do this, right? Because it just, we both live in the 49 of 50 states that do not require anybody to have any certification or training to say they do sex therapy. So what do you have to say on that topic?
Oh, man. Yes. So I always get really excited when I have a therapist contact me for supervision, which means that I oversee their process of becoming a sex therapist, because that means that they've noticed what most therapists will notice, which is that at some point, sexuality shows itself. Especially if you're working with couples, how do we avoid it? And like we talked about earlier, we all have our stuff around it. We all have healing to do around it, every single one of us. And because of that, and the bizarro stuff that culturally we've experienced around sex and sexuality, there inevitably tends to be a lot of discomfort around going there with folks, going there with our clients, going there with the couple. So you get, a lot of therapy that is amazing therapy, but that doesn't touch on that.
Yeah.
Or where there's kind of this, well, that's not my area. We're going to stay over here. So I just feel like it's part of what makes us human. It's even if you're you don't have to be having sex very often. You don't have to be an incredibly sexual person, but this is still part of who we are. And we still have internalized messages around that. And it still has an impact on our relationships and how we do intimacy and how we do closeness and how we do vulnerability. It is, you cannot unravel it from those things.
Right.
And so I feel like it should be part of every training to some extent to become a therapist in any capacity. But especially if you're working with relationships, if you're working with couples, it just feels like such a huge area of human life to not have some sort of understanding around, some sort of training around, so that you are unafraid to venture there with your clients, who most of the time are very much so afraid.
Right. So, okay, so that's a big part of the world of therapy where people don't want to go there. But then I'm thinking, okay, there are people that want to go there who say they do sex therapy, but who've not necessarily had any training, right? Like, what's the difference for those of us that are certified who pursued this? Or maybe more importantly, how does somebody who's listening to this and thinking, okay, I want to find a sex therapist, how do they distinguish who's qualified and who isn't, or how do they find somebody that's really got the background to do this?
Absolutely. There are several different training institutes in the United States, but there's one big governing body, and that's ASECT, and that's the American Association for Sexuality Counselors, Educators, and Therapists. And so to become a sex therapist or an educator or a counselor, you have to train through them. And this is a really, really rigorous training.
Yes, it is.
A really rigorous training. This is several years. You have to, as a therapist, you have to see 300 cases, sex therapy cases. You have to track those cases, and you have to have a supervisor that oversees those cases. 300 cases before they'll even consider certifying you. And it just speaks to, again, the enormity of this work.
Yeah.
The courses that you take. So, there's 130 hours of courses total.
160
hours. 160 hours of courses. And so people get really overwhelmed by that, right? Like, that's a lot of information. It's a lot of content. But once you start diving into this, you realize, like, oh, this one course, I could train in this for weeks.
Right. So, it's still just the tip of the iceberg, right?
It's still just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And again, that's what people have a hard time comprehending, is that to work with a therapist who's really well-versed in sexuality means that they've gone through an enormous amount of training. And the thing for me and in my work that also distinguishes it is the behavioral component.
Yeah.
We can talk about sexual pain. We can talk about sexual trauma and how that has an impact on the body, things like sexual aversion. But how do we treat it?
Yeah.
how do we treat it? And that's what you get when you train to become a sex therapist, as opposed to taking a few classes where you learn a little bit more about sexuality, or it's like an advanced version of a sexology 101 class that you took in college.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. How do I work with, folks who have undergone prostate cancer surgery and now are trying to understand how to have a sexual life anew with this, trying to understand how their body works now. How do we work with folks who have been through cancer and their body works differently or looks differently or functions differently? How do we address vaginismus and using things like dilators or our fingers to show the body that penetration is safe? Right. These are all things that you get specifically in this training.
So for anybody listening, the first choice number one would be somebody who's ASECT certified, right? Because then that these people have had 300 hours of cases and all the training and all the supervision and everything else.
They've basically they really have gone through getting another degree.
Right,
really.
Right. Barring that, if somebody in your area doesn't have that, at least I would say look at their training. What do they have? I mean, and it should be extensive, because I just want people to realize that a lot of people say they do sex therapy. And I don't even think they're really poorly intentioned. Like, I think they think, I'm a therapist and I'm comfortable talking about sex, so I can say I do sex therapy. But they don't have all that training or all that context. They're just working from their own experiences or their own mindset about this, and not a broader.
That's I don't want to use the word scary, but it is kind of scary.
It's a little scary once you realize what actually goes into this training. It's like, holy cow! I just don't think they don't know what they don't know.
I mean, and there are lots of things that end up in my office that have gone through therapists who have inadvertently caused more harm.
Yeah.
Yes, this is sex. You're a sex addict.
Right.
You have to stop having sex completely, or there's a lot of really well-intentioned therapists who are also just dealing with the funky things that they've internalized living in our funky society around sex and sexuality. And so we hand those things on and unintentionally cause more harm. Yeah. So it's really important that, that you are working with someone who's trained, who's sex positive, and has gone through, a good amount. ASECT has this thing called a SAR. It's a sexuality attitude reassessment.
Yeah.
I'm hosting one this weekend, but it's intended to really challenge participants by virtue of showing them really explicit media of different kinds of things that have been considered taboo in our culture, some things not so much, so that as a sex therapist or educator or counselor, you can be supremely aware of your hot spots, your areas of discomfort, your biases, any prejudice that you have. And that's so hugely important, because we don't want to do further harm around this already bruised area of life for us, right?
Right.
And we want someone who's going to be able to go in and bust up those myths for you,
right?
In a really thought out, informed way.
Yeah. Cool. So where can people learn more about you? Where do they find you online, or, what you've got to offer?
Yeah. So right now, I'm not actually seeing clients at the moment. I'm on like a extended maternity leave. So right now I am being a supervisor through ASECT for therapists who want to become sex therapists. And I'm teaching. I teach at South Shore Sexual Health Center in Quincy, Massachusetts, and I teach for the Institute of Sexuality, Education, and Enlightenment, which is everything's online right now. But we have several different spots where they teach in person, like Portland, Oregon, and Tucson, Arizona, and here in Massachusetts. So I'm teaching. So I have a website. It's Paula Leech, Leech.com. And that basically talks about the supervision that I do, my values as a supervisor. As I've mentioned lots of times, becoming a sex therapist is healing. Doing the work of sex therapy is healing. So I take training sex therapists really seriously as well. And so so folks can learn about who I am as a supervisor and what my philosophy is, and learn about some of the teaching that I've done and stuff on my website.
Okay. And potential clients, I guess, around Boston could keep their eye on whether you open up a practice again, right? If they could stalk that website, right? And see if you go back to working with clients.
Yes. And, I do workshops and stuff, but that's the plan, is to eventually move back into clinical work. Obviously, with everything going on, it's kind of like, oh, well, what's that going to look like now? I don't know. So it's still formulating all of that. But I do intend to get back into it because, like I said, I really love the work.
Yeah.
It's really meaningful and important to me. So,
well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You are welcome.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question and answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.